Here are some of the questions from the participants at the online Alumni Association event at which I first presented this presentation. The first of these was a question about a concern about inequalities in food supply and in agricultural production capability within countries and between countries. The question was put to me whether this was a serious problem. And the answer is yes, it is a serious problem. It's a major contributor to the lack of access to food in many parts of the world. The Global Food and Environment Institute engages in this by working with regional partners in key parts of the world. The AFRICAP project is the best example of this. We work with regional partners who lead on setting the challenges, and we help work with them to help find solution to these challenges. In the case of the AFRICAP project, we're trying to provide innovation with smallholder farmers on their tillage and crop production methods to improve soil management and crop rotations so that it can handle weather extremes much more reliably and still produce food in a much more reliable manner. That's one example, but this is a major problem worldwide. You can tell by my accent that I'm not from Yorkshire. I'm an adopted son of Yorkshire. I've worked and lived here for several decades now. And one of the things that I'm really proud about working with the UK is the commitment of the UK government, which is enshrined in law to spend 0.7% of national GDP on international aid. And some of this helps to fund programs like the AFRICAP project. And this gives us an opportunity to work with key leaders around the world to help solve some of these inequalities and to tackle other challenges as well. Our key partner in Africa is the organization FANAPAN, which is a Pan-African think tank helping to provide innovation for national policy on food and agriculture in particular. And they guide us on some of the challenges that we need to tackle, and we work very effectively with them. There was a question put to me asking to what extent I think smart farming methods will affect changes to the UK landscape. I think that the changes will not be visually dramatic. The infrastructure for things like digital communications are already in place around the UK countryside, so I don't expect massive changes in that respect. One of the things that we do see is a move towards more varied cropping, novel rotations. So perhaps the landscape will be less monochrome and less monoculture as we move towards the future, with more variety of crop cover, more variation within fields and between years. And also there is a recognition that some of the ecological value, which does add value in many ways to farming systems, is obtained through hedgerows and other areas where farming is set aside either periodically or in some parts of a farm, perhaps permanently, to support biodiversity. So I think that these changes will be more on some of the details of cropping and rotations and how livestock is integrated into farming systems, into cropping systems, but I don't expect to see a dramatic change in terms visually in the landscape, in terms of infrastructure. One change that will quite possibly take place over the coming decade or two is a move towards much more use of autonomous vehicles. So when we see tractors in the fields, and we see aerial vehicles spraying crops, they may not be manned by individuals who are in the vehicle, but manned remotely. I received a question about what is the Global Food and Environment Institute and the University of Leeds Farm doing to influence government policy to help adopt the innovations that I presented in this talk. and that could help influence businesses to do things differently. The biggest role of research in policy, in my view, is to provide scientific evidence for the things that work and don't work. We have a range of options that will be trialed. We will make measurements, make observations, we will do calculations on farms as potential changes in farming systems are being implemented. These can be tried first at the University of Leeds farm or other research facilities so that commercial farms are not taking on the commercial risk. These could be de-risked with, for example, partial funding by research council, research projects. But by getting this evidence, and by working jointly with farmers as we produce this evidence and reporting this transparently to government agencies, this gives an opportunity to provide the scientific evidence and also evidence on things like financial viability that will help point the way forward, and it will also point out where the dead ends might be and what not to pursue, and that this approach is informing not only government policy, but also businesses and corporate policy. I asked a very obvious question in April of 2020 when I first gave this talk about whether I thought the COVID-19 pandemic will affect global food supplies, and do we think that there will be a switch to eating more seasonal food grown locally? So there is another presentation recorded by my colleague, Professor Caroline Orfila, who is Associate Director of the Global Food and Environment Institute working on urban food consumption, and she tackles this explicitly for the Leeds City region. So I'm not going to comment in this talk on the issue of seasonal food grown locally. I urge viewers to see Caroline's talk where she talks about this in much more detail. But I do want to comment about the global food supply chains. In the Northern Hemisphere, in the wealthier economies, we have these amazing supermarkets that provide food from all over the world and keep shelves outside of disruptions like a pandemic extremely well stocked. And this relies on just-in-time supplying. Well, the supply chains are very flexible and continuous. This helps keep food prices low because it reduces investment in inventory and in storage facilities for food. So food is moving from the point of production very rapidly from any point in the world to our supermarket shelves very rapidly. And the problem is, of course, when you have such a dramatic and rapid shutdown in businesses, in many different types of businesses, as occurred during the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic and the national lockdowns that were implemented in many parts of the world, is that this just-in-time supply is disrupted. And this was evidenced, of course, immediately. It's clearly seen that some supermarket shelves were bare, but over time, as the supply chains adjusted, alternative sources were found. These were generally being replenished after the first few weeks of the pandemic, at least in the UK. But of course, this is perhaps with a narrow range of products and still some periodic shortages becoming evident. But there was also, because of the immediate shutdown in the hospitality sector, restaurants, pubs, hotels, there was a huge surplus of food that was in storage there. I'm very pleased that in many of these situations in Leeds and other places around the UK, much of this food was diverted rapidly, particularly through the work of local government, charities, and the volunteer sector to help support food banks and those who were shielding from the virus. But this just-in-time system of food supply has received a warning shot. It is a clear wake-up call that this system keeps prices low. It provides quite a wide range of supplies in the UK, but it is vulnerable to shocks. And I think we will see major changes going forward in food supply chain companies and how they source their food, considering contingency plans on how they manage shocks to food supply. I was asked how the work of the Global Institute in Leeds and work on the farm can be relevant for agriculture in other parts of the world, for example, in Southeast Asia or in Africa. And the point I want to make is that as a global institute, much of our research is joint with programs around the world. I gave the example of the AFRICAT project and working in China. Now, in this type of work, what is essential is the partnership. We do work on the University of Leeds farm, that might have crops which are not suitable for growing in China, for example, or in Africa where we are working. However, there are other major parts of the agricultural production system, particularly the natural environment, that do follow some broad patterns. We understand generally what controls soil fertility, how water moves within soil, how irrigation works. And so there are many aspects of agriculture production, particularly environmental controls on plant growth, and crop growth, and nutrient content of vegetation for human consumption and for livestock feed that will be relevant regardless where the research is being carried out. So even if the crops might not be the same, even if the animals might not be the same, what we learn about how to improve soil fertility in the UK is very likely to be relevant for how we might improve soil fertility in another part of the world, as an example. So those are the examples that I have from the questions I received when I first gave the presentation on smart agriculture at the University of Leeds Alumni Association event on the 20th of April, 2020. And these were my overview of those questions and responses. Thank you.